Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1965. We're going to be taking a look at the Seekers and they're going to be performing A World of Our Own. And this is coming from their first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show over in the USA. So let's get the guys up on screen and see how they get on. We're going to watch this the whole way through because it's only 2 minutes in length and then we'll get into the analysis after.
Close the door, light the light. We're staying home tonight, far away from the bustle and the bright city lights. Let them all fade away. Just leave us alone, and we'll live in a world of our own. We'll build a world of our own that no one else can share. All our sorrows will leave far behind us there, and I know you will find there'll be peace of mind when we live in a world of our own. Oh my love, I cried for you so much, lonely nights without sleeping while I long for your touch. Now your lips can erase the heartache I've known. Come with me to a world of our own. We'll build a world of our own that no one else can share. All our sorrows will leave far behind us there, and I know you will find there'll be peace of mind when we live in a world of our own. And I know you will find there'll be peace of mind when we live in a world of our own.
And there we have it. So this is a bit shorter in terms of the version they're playing because it's on TV. In the original, we do have some guitar solo work in there as well. But this performance and why it works so well, the first thing to point out, by the way, is that they're playing their own instruments and they're singing live. In 1965, that was just the done deal that you needed to be able to play an instrument. And by the way, Judith also plays piano. She can play an instrument as well. So across the board, obviously here on tambourine duty. Recently, I've featured a few bands that have been more vocal orientated and certainly had that as a focal point, as well as being able to play instruments at the same time. But we've got another example here. In the other bands, there were ranges that were similar. For example, the Mamas and the Papas that I featured not so long ago, where their ranges were quite similar. So some of those melody lines were interlinking with each other. But here, the Seekers are a band that did have separate vocal ranges to the point where you would have a definite focal vocal that you could listen to up the front of the stage, and that's Judith up at the front with her soprano range. And you've got the guys in the background supplying almost a barbershop vocal. I know that they're not a barbershop quartet, there's only 3 of them, but having these lines that interlink with each other but that are all in a similar range for the male vocals, it means you get that barbershop quality to it with that soprano vocal just layered on top. Certainly in this live performance, Judith's vocal just sits on top due to the fact that she's slightly closer to the microphone, but also just how it was mixed on the night. We've got Keith on 12 string as well, who has to lean in to provide his backing vocal. And again, it's going to be a lot clearer if they each had a mic, but unfortunately, just with the setup, he has to lean in, so it might be that he's slightly in the background, but it still works really well because the vocals are so solid the whole way through. Just to mention the members of the band, we've got Athel Guy here on double bass, and Bruce Woodley is supplying a bit of rhythm on that classical guitar. We've got a lot of the rhythm work being done by Keith Potger on his 12 string here, as well as playing that lead intro, and we don't have the lead solo that's on the record. As I said, this performance has been cut down for TV, but then we've also got Judith Durham up the front of the stage with her unique vocal delivery that she has, but also the the way that she applies that vibrato to her voice whenever she's holding onto a note for any length of time. You'll notice it always comes in. When she stops the phrases quite short, obviously we're not going to hear it, but it's something that gives Judith her vocal personality through that sound, that application of vibrato. It is so unique as well because the frequency is dead on, the same frequency the whole time. So you know that it's Judith's voice because it's almost something that is natural. She doesn't look like she's trying to apply it after the fact. It's instantly on that vocal whenever the line is being held. Like I said, those notes are just singing the whole time because that vibrato is instant and it's always on there. So the way that this has been arranged vocally, you might find sometimes that the male vocal and one harmony line is actually the same line that Judith is singing, but obviously Judith is an octave higher, so that'll just give a lot of body to that original melody line that she's singing that will naturally be the focus because of that change in range. But you'll also find that vocally we're singing all the time here together in the verse and the first chorus, but as soon as we get to that second verse, we're now changing to oohs and ahs that are being sung by the male section of the group, so that it just sits underneath Judith even more. So now there's just that focus intentionally on Judith's voice as the front person of the band, and having that focal point means that when the other voices then do come in for the chorus, it's going to have more impact because now you've got four voices where really you were listening to the lyrical content just from Judith during that verse. So again, these tiny details of arranging the vocal parts in such a way to keep it interesting the whole time. I know that this performance is only a couple of minutes, if that, so once you've heard it, there was no chance to get bored because it's so short. You just rewind it back to the beginning. This is just something that happened in the 60s, very short songs, between 2 and 3 minutes in length. But for these live performances, you can have so much going on in such a short time because they still approach it like a 3-minute song, or nowadays a 4-minute song. All of the bands implement all of these ideas in order to keep it interesting the whole time for 3 or 4 minutes. So once you start putting all of these elements into a 2-minute performance, you definitely have to rewind it back to appreciate all the different vocal parts, but also how it's been arranged and how they execute the performance. The instrumental ability of a great group of musicians as we have here will always be an afterthought because it is so well executed that there's nothing that sticks out. Often when you're listening to a group or a band who are playing and there's something that's slightly out, or the timing's off, or we've got a lot of fret buzz coming from a 12-string, for example, that becomes a focus because it pops out. Because it's not that good, is a little mistake, whereas when you don't get any mistakes, you can then focus on the composition, you can focus on the vocals and the melody, and you never question the instrumental ability. But then when you do put it under the spotlight, you start to realize how good these players are to nail it live, but also to sing in harmony with each other at the same time. I am going to get into a bit of the story behind the Seekers because they were the first Australian band to make it big in the UK, and that also crossed over to the USA as well as being massively successful in Australia. And it all started in 1962, but Judith wasn't around straight away because Keith, Bruce and Athol all went to school together in high school, so they knew each other from then, and Judith joined a little bit later on because it's when her and Athol worked at the same advertising agency, and she was singing standard jazz numbers, and she would get involved with the other three guys and perform at gigs, but wasn't an official part of the band until she started to play with them more regularly and did then officially join the band. And when they started playing together, doing gigs, they started to build up a following. Judith had previously done some recording with Frank Trainor's Jazz Preachers, and that was with W&G Records, so she had some contacts there. She still had her foot in the door, so they signed a deal with W&G Records and recorded their first album in 1963, and that was called Introducing the Seekers, which did really well. It charted well, and off the back of this, in 1964, they were then offered a place on a cruise ship for a 12-month stint. So they got on this cruise ship and they arrived in the UK in 1964, and they were due to stay there for just 10 weeks, but They were offered work from a booking agency, which they took, and they signed to World Club Record, which was a postal service sending records to people. I guess it was like a really early version of Amazon in terms of sending records out to people that have ordered them. So that eventually got taken over by EMI, but that's where they first got their break in the UK. So things are going really well in the UK. This is all still in 1964. It's all moving really quickly, and then they get a massive break because they get to appear on TV with Ronnie Carroll on his show called Call In on Carroll. And there was also a gig that Dusty Springfield was playing, but a band pulled out at the last minute, and these guys were available just to fill in, which they did, and they bumped into Tom Springfield, who then wrote them a song, and it was called I'll Never Find Another You. And they recorded this again still at the end of 1964. It was released by EMI, and at this point they weren't signed to EMI. It was just a song that EMI got a hold of and then distributed to see how it did in the charts. So by early 1965, they were at number 1 in the UK charts and the Australian charts, and they were at number 4 in the US charts. They were also appearing regularly here in the UK on the BBC, and they released their next song called What Have They Done to the Rain? And that wasn't as successful, but the third song they released was this one, A World of Our Own, and that was another Tom Springfield track, and that was a top 20 hit in the USA and a top 10 hit here in the UK. They had another big hit with The Carnival Is Over. That was a number 1 in the UK and Australia. And the year of this performance, 1965, is when they met Paul Simon, and Paul and Bruce started working together and writing songs. And they had their own TV special in 1966. And they were also voted by the NME the best new group of 1965. And they also played at this time at Wembley Arena with the Beatles, the Animals, Dusty Springfield, and the Rolling Stones. In 1966, they released Morningtown Ride, which was a huge hit here in the UK, got to number 2 in the charts, and by early 1967, it had made it into the top 50 of the US charts. But also, in 1966, in December, they released Georgie Girl, which was the title theme song for the film of the same name, and that was a huge hit in early 1967 in the USA. It had got up to number 2 in the charts there. In 1967, they returned to Australia for their homecoming tour, and at one of the performances there, they played to over 200,000 people, which was a new Guinness World Record for an attendance in the Southern Hemisphere. In 1968 is when Judith announced that she was going to be leaving the band, and the BBC put on a special that was called Farewell the Seekers. And to give you an idea of the popularity of the band in the UK at that time, that was tuned in to by over 10 million of the population here in the UK. They released a greatest hits album at this time, and it went to number 1 in the UK here, displacing the Beatles with their White Album, and it stayed there for 6 weeks, and it stayed at number 1 in the Australian charts for 17 weeks. And pretty much every other band, including the Rolling Stones, couldn't get into the charts at this point because the Seekers were just dominating it with their greatest hits. So with Judith leaving, there were various personnel changes throughout the 70s and the 80s. They did reunite in 1992, and that reunion performance led to a tour. I don't think they got together thinking that they were going to have a fully fledged relaunch of the Seekers, but it turned into a 102-date tour after that point, and they were sellout dates as well. They also released Future Road in 1997. In 2001, they released Morningtown Ride to Christmas, and that went platinum in Australia, a hugely successful album again. And in 2013 is when they had their Golden Jubilee tour celebrating 50 years, and that was met with rave reviews and lots of sellouts during that tour as well, just as successful as ever. Unfortunately, after the first date that they did in Melbourne, Judith suffered a brain hemorrhage, so they had to obviously postpone some of those gigs, but they only postponed them, didn't cancel them. They continued on with that tour, completed all of those dates, and ended up with 2 shows at the Royal Albert Hall here in London. And in 2019 is when Judith said she was going to call it a day for the live performances, and they did release at that point the album that was called Farewell. That album is a live recording from the 2013 tour that I just mentioned, and now that Judith isn't performing anymore, they're called the Original Seekers, and that fourth vocal spot has been filled by Michael Cristiano. But it's great to have a look back at 1965 with the Seekers in full flow. They were already massively popular in the UK, and to think that they'd be pushing bands like the Beatles off the top spot in the UK charts later in the decade. But thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!